What would you say you do here?
That's my question to you, Congress. Trump hardly mentioned legislation in his 100-minute address to you on Tuesday night, and yet Trump would be wise to include Congress, I believe, to enact his agenda. After all, every single executive order that he signs can simply be undone by a future Democrat in the White House. I'm going to highlight a couple of things that Congress should get involved in. Spoiler alert, it's tariffs. But first, let's run through some of DOGE's accomplishments, mistakes, oversteps, and sort of what to think about DOGE right now. Pretty sure nothing has received more attention since Trump took office than the so-called Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, because it's fun to make jokes. I don't love it, but I say so-called because it's not really a department. Trump's lawyers smartly just rebranded the U.S. Digital Service, which was an Obama executive office. That means it was not created by Congress. It's just funded by Congress. And that's only important to mention because the most common complaint I hear about Elon Musk running it is that no one elected him. I really hate to break it to these people, but that is the case for absolutely everyone in the executive branch, every federal employee, because, except for Donald J. Trump, of course, and John Dorian Vance. I think that's what his initials stand for, right? No? Okay, guess not. So you can ignore those complaints, even though I'm confident that the jokes about Musk being the real president really irritate Trump, and that's kind of fun to think about. But the problem with DOGE so far is that they're moving at a breakneck speed with no obvious oversight and very little transparency. So it's frankly very hard to know if they're accomplishing anything of worth. Let's start there. Are they doing anything of worth? So Elon Musk pledged during the campaign that he could cut $2 trillion from the annual budget, but that is just impossible. He since revised that to $1 trillion, but that is also impossible. That's not just because Congress controls funding and he can't do such a thing alone, constitutionally at least, but because the total discretionary budget, meaning the stuff that Congress can decide to fund or not, as opposed to entitlements like Social Security and Medicare, which are required to spend money on, the entire discretionary budget is $1.79 trillion. Even Elon's revised goal of finding $1 trillion in savings is not possible because Trump, at least in the past, has said that he can't touch defense spending. That leaves around $900 billion totals. So that's not even $1 trillion. Elon could fire every single government employee, and we could not balance the budget, as Trump claims he would do in his speech the other night. And they've been tweeting, and Republicans have been going, oh, we're going to do it. We're going to balance the budget. You're not going to balance the budget unless you look at Social Security, quite frankly, okay? Also, as much hullabaloo, that's kind of an old word, I don't know why I'm using it, as there was around Musk taking a wrecking ball to USAID, foreign aid accounts for less than 1% of the federal budget. It's a blip on the radar of our federal debt. The savings would be wiped out by any number of Trump's other proposals. For example, ending tax on tips. Just one. That doesn't mean that we should just throw up our hands and say, oh, well, and allow the waste, fraud, and abuse to run rampant in the federal government. It would just be a lot smarter if Trump and Musk didn't claim there was more there than there is. That sentence is terrible, but no one likes waste, fraud, and abuse, right? No one likes that. Well, I mean, except for the people that are actually benefiting and from that waste, fraud, and abuse. But, American taxpayers do not. And they certainly, I think, Democrats and Republicans would like the government to be more efficient. So the goals, I think, are worthy, right? I think we can agree on that. But the problem with Musk thus far is that there has been a pattern of him claiming he's found, and I quote, the biggest fraud in history, and then being completely wrong about it. The fraud Musk was referring to there were that 18 million people in the Social Security database are over 100 years old without a death date. Trump spent way longer than was funny Tuesday highlighting each age bracket, but the thing is, that doesn't mean those alleged centenarians are receiving any payments at all. In fact, Social Security automatically stops for anyone over 115 unless they can prove they're still alive. I'd even argue maybe that age is a little high, but this is not new information that Musk uncovered. This is not something he found. He may genuinely believe so, but all he had to do was check out this July 2023 Inspector General report that said SSA's Numidian included approximately 18.9 million number holders who were born in 1920 or earlier, but had no death information on their Numidian record. Turns out if he just had asked someone before tweeting, Xing, is that what we call it now? He could have avoided not looking like such an idiot. There is undoubtedly fraud happening. Not at the levels that Elon Musk is claiming, but we know that there is fraud and he has uncovered some. We should find that and eliminate it. I'm all for that part, but this is not the gigantic deal that Musk and Trump have made it out to be. There are 3 different articles in the description you can check out if you want to learn more about the Social Security stuff, but it basically boils down to this. Yes, there are a lot of numbers in the system. Yes, some of those don't have death dates. There are a couple of reasons for that. One, some of them were born before Social Security existed and we don't have good death records, and it would cost something like $5 to $9 million to clean those records out. I'd argue maybe we should do that. It'd be worth just having those gone, but they're not getting paid. This is not the thing that they think it is. This is a database problem. It's not actually a fraud problem. So another example of Musk's mistakes is that he and his team accidentally added 3 zeros to the number 8 million and claimed that they had found an $8 billion contract for the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, something that might have been an obvious mistake to Musk if he took a moment to realize the entire budget of ICE was $9.1 billion total last year. And obviously, a single contract would not exist for 88% of that budget. That would seem very unlikely, right? I don't think Musk is an idiot. I just think that he is so unfamiliar with how this stuff works, he should be partnering with someone else that could, answer the question. Outside of USAID, Musk and Trump have gone about firing hundreds of thousands of federal employees, sometimes with buyouts, sometimes with eliminating their positions, and sometimes just because they're new employees and so they're getting rid of them. Some are for performance issues. We've got so much information on this that it's hard to understand because there's been something like 270,000 people fired or resigned. So this has been done sort of haphazardly at best in some cases. They've had to sort of quickly rehire hundreds of employees who are in charge of things like, overseeing our nuclear arsenal or making sure pacemakers are safe, or even ones working on combating the current bird flu, which, while I generally think it's foolish for presidents to claim that they're able to control prices from the White House, or for us to believe them when they claim they can, it does seem like firing the people in charge of combating the bird flu could, lead to egg prices being higher for longer, right? Which I'm sure Trump doesn't want to be blamed for. So look, the thing is, I truly do want a smaller, more efficient federal government, but I worry that Musk and his minions are far too cocky when they clearly don't understand a lot about the federal bureaucracy. My suggestion, as if anyone in the Trump administration cares or is paying attention to me, is to partner him with congressional Republicans or experts on specific agencies and spending outside of the government. Maybe someone like Chris Edwards at Cato Institute, who has been writing well thought out proposals for cutting government waste and inefficiencies for decades, because the goals are worthy, even if their execution is a big mess right now. And I do think it is a huge mess right now. Beyond the obvious disorganization of it all, DOGE is facing legal hurdles. Just yesterday, the Supreme Court said a lower court's ruling that said the Trump administration must release $2 billion in foreign aid it owes for work they're already being completed must go on. So I won't go into all the details of all these legal cases because they are literally still happening right now. But in case you are curious about which ones Trump has won, which ones he's lost, there's a Forbes article below you can reference that lists all of them as of yesterday. The hardest part about trying to understand what's happening with DOGE is that the media bias is pretty outrageous on this one. The right wants so badly to pretend that Musk is balancing the budget and cheer on his every ill-informed tweet or X or whatever. And the federal workforce and media in D.C. and its surrounding counties are so left-leaning they cannot possibly look at this from outside of their biases. Seriously, take a look at this map. It is actually pretty shocking. If you don't think there's a bias going in, this is the voting results of 2024. Here we're in Washington, D.C., plus 78, plus 82, plus 87, plus 86 for Kamala Harris. This is Kamala Harris winning 90% of the vote in all of these counties surrounding. This is crazy. That certainly doesn't seem democratic or representative to me. What do you think? Will DOGE accomplish anything significant? Will they potentially do more harm than good? Let me know in the comments. I think it's going to be a mixed bag. I think they'll expose some waste, fraud, abuse, inefficiencies, but I think it'll largely be a distraction from what we actually need to talk about if we want to rein in the $33 trillion in national debt. Social Security and Medicare. We have to fix those things. We cannot continue down this path. But the problem is presidents don't want to do that. Those are unpopular. And frankly, they're things that are going to happen in the future when Donald Trump is dead. Okay. Regardless, we need to let the courts work this stuff out. I'm not sure what is legal and not legal for DOGE to do. But I trust that lawyers and courts are going to be smarter than I am, and we should let them kind of work this out. Now, if at some point those courts tell Trump he can't do something and he continues to do so anyway, then I'm going to be happy to criticize it. I'm happy to have my hair on fire at that point and say that we have a constitutional crisis, but that hasn't happened yet. Unfortunately, we have had several presidents in a row now who treat their sworn oath to uphold the Constitution as an annoying little inconvenience to the things that they want to do. So they just do whatever they want to, even if they think it might not hold in court or they know it's illegal, just so they can get a win in the news cycle, and then they can blame the courts conveniently for being meanie pants when they strike it down in the future. That's on us as American voters for continuing to elect these kind of presidents and the members of Congress who won't hold them accountable. And speaking of Congress, I am not the only one who thinks Trump's tariffs on Canada and Mexico are a bad idea, as I've mentioned before, but I think they'll not only be disastrous to the U.S. economy, but I think they have the potential to actually tank Trump's second term and his agenda. Instead of just complaining about him and complaining about tariffs on this time, I'm going to offer a solution. What a novel idea. I'm going to not just talk about the problem, let's talk about the solution. Unfortunately, it involves Congress doing their jobs. Yeah, I know it's not very likely to happen, but seriously, I'm being serious about this. Republicans in Congress would be doing Trump a favor. He might not act as so in the moment, and he might not ever forgive them for it, and they might lose their seats in Congress. But seriously, they would be doing the country and Trump favor by reining in his worst instincts. And I think these tariffs are one of those things. So if you're like me and you consider yourself a conservative, I think it's important to be aware of what you are trying to conserve. I think you should have to define that. I believe personally that almost all of our current problems in America flow out of one specific thing: us straying from the Constitution's ingenious structure. And so that's what I think is worth conserving, is the Constitution. So let's look at what the Constitution specifically says about tariffs. First, a little bit of historical context before we dive into the text. Tariffs were once the federal government's primary revenue source. We did not have an income tax until the 1900s. So throughout the 1800s, tariffs provided around 90% of federal revenue. Alexander Hamilton, our most famous rapping founding father, advocated for them as a way to protect the rapidly growing manufacturing sector in America while also promoting industrial growth for the long term. The long term, something that no one in Washington seems to think about these days, as previously mentioned. And it should be noted that tariffs were on specific goods, not imposed broadly on all items imported to the country like Trump just recently did. Those would be traditionally called imposts. James Madison supported this kind of customs tax, the impost, because he feared that industry-specific tariffs on things like specific fruits or dairy or whatever, that would lead inevitably to Congress being a favor trading factory, which it did indeed become over the next century and a half. And we still see this kind of stuff today with tariffs. For instance, this week, Trump immediately carved out a 30-day reprieve for American auto companies on these Canadian and Mexican tariffs, which seems kind of unfair, right? It's like, okay, farmers, you've got to deal with the tax, but you guys don't if you make cars. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me, honestly. Regardless of Hamilton winning the tariff argument with Madison, the Constitution quite clearly states who gets to set those tariffs, or any taxes actually. It's Congress. So Article 1, Section 8 says, the Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. And it goes on to say, to regulate commerce with foreign nations. So let's go back to Article 2, the part of the Constitution that lays out the president's powers, and tax, commerce, impost. None of those words are mentioned, oddly enough. So what the hell happened? Well, Congress gave away their power, essentially. After the Great Depression, Congress gave the president power to negotiate trade agreements within set limits. But by 1974, to address non-tariff barriers, Congress created Trade Promotion Authority, TPA, allowing trade deals to get simple up or down votes without amendments, as long as the president met certain conditions. Not going to get into all those conditions here, but the TPA actually last expired in 2021. Separately, presidents can adjust tariffs for national security, foreign policy, or economic emergencies under various laws, often based on findings from U.S. agencies. And that is what Trump is using to implement these tariffs. It's a 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA. All the president has to do is declare an emergency of any kind, and he gets special powers. How could Congress be so stupid to not have a check on that, you might ask? Well, they actually did try to have a check on that. In the IEEPA law and hundreds of others, they included a legislative veto option that said basically a simple concurrent resolution by both chambers, meaning simple majorities could pass them and they would require no executive branch approval, could rescind that, right? The bad news is the Supreme Court then, correctly in my opinion, said that legislative vetoes were unconstitutional. This is via Annie McCarthy at National Review. The majority reasoned that congressional vetoes were legislative acts and therefore, to pass constitutional muster, they had to be passed by both chambers and signed by the president, or enacted over a presidential veto by the arduous override procedure, which you may know is you got to get 2/3 of Congress to override a veto. That means all the laws that Congress passed, giving the president the ability to act quickly in actual emergencies, which I think is a valid thing to do potentially, but they have no check on them other than Congress could try to repeal the law, which would require the president's signature, who's obviously not going to get them, or they got to get that 2/3 veto-proof majority in Congress. And that's why the executive branch has been abusing these laws more and more over the past decades. You might wonder, what is the national emergency Trump is saying we're in to justify the tariffs? That's a great question. The problem is it does not matter because Congress wasn't specific enough about how emergency declaration should work. Biden abused the same emergency powers to do things like try to cancel student debt or enact an eviction moratorium. The big problem that this causes is that Americans have no idea what rules and regulations might change tomorrow because we've given too much power to one man or woman for that couple of hours that Kamala was president while Biden was getting a colonoscopy. Charlie Cook, also at National Review, says it better than I could. Written law yields both stability and comprehension. Written law that once established can only be changed by the acquiescence of lots and lots of people aids those ends yet further. The last thing you want when dealing with regulation, tax rates, tariffs, or anything else of that sort is to wake up one morning and discover that all the rules have been changed on the whim because their power is vested in one person. Presidents can do that. Because its power is vested in 535 people, Congress cannot. If I had my way, Congress would repeal the executive branch's ability to enact tariffs fully, but we would still have hundreds of other laws that Congress passed that give the president those emergency powers. So what I think they should do is pass a law that says that any presidentially declared emergency can only last a certain number of days before it would require a joint resolution of approval from Congress to continue. This would force both parties to decide and vote one way or another anytime a president declares an emergency. You know, they would get to decide, is this an actual emergency? It would have the added benefit of people would have to make that vote, even if their own party is in the White House. There have been attempts at this, actually. The most recent attempt was the National Security Powers Act of 2021, which would have required Congress to pass a joint resolution approving the national emergencies within 30 days. It was co-sponsored by, get this, Senator Mike Lee, Bernie Sanders, Edward Markey, and Elizabeth Warren, and went absolutely nowhere, unfortunately. But you know, one way to pique my curiosity on legislation is for it to be co-sponsored by both the furthest right and furthest left members of Congress. So a good question here is, why would Congress try to do their jobs now after, decades of giving away their power to the executive branch? Well, first of all, Democrats are basically wandering in the desert of their 2024 loss and seem to be completely directionless. Just look at that speech the other night. You had some people waving signs, some people getting kicked out, some people sitting quietly. They have no idea what to do about Donald Trump. But they could immediately take some credit for preventing the economic disaster that is going to happen with these tariffs, something that they desperately need credibility on since voters fairly blamed Biden and all the Democrats for the worst inflation in 40 years. That is the albatross around their neck right now. But what could Republicans possibly have to gain from taking away some of Trump's powers? Of course, they'd also be taking away future Democrats' powers. Of course, I completely realize that Republicans in Congress are totally fine capitulating to Trump these days, but they should understand that it's in everyone's best interest to stop these tariffs. Okay, it's nonsense. American companies are being whiplashed by the on-again, off-again tariff threats, and the markets certainly don't like it. The American stocks are down since Trump's election and have dropped precipitously in reaction to his tariff announcements. Some of these Republicans in Congress are bound to lose their jobs in the midterms if these tariffs raise prices on Americans, and beyond counting on them to selfishly guard their own power by getting reelected, it would be good for Trump if someone stopped him from his most impulsive bad ideas. Trump really loves to talk about the mandate that he received last November, but he's a fool if he thinks voters wanted higher prices. Congressional Republicans should take away his ability to act impulsively for his own sake, if nothing else. But, returning to the Constitution's original structure of checks and balances would be a desirable byproduct of it. Don't worry, though, I'm not holding my breath. So now you know what mattered yesterday in U.S. politics. If you want to read more, I have sources in the description below, and you can drop your questions about today's news in the comments so I can answer them on tomorrow's show. I'll see you then.